The streets are silent. The air carries the weight of forgotten voices. No clocks, no names, no cities, just endless sand stretching into memory. Now imagine this. Beneath your bare feet, somewhere beneath that silence, there lies a city older than history. A city that knew how to write before most people knew what time was. You walk on ground that once pulsed with the breath of civilization's first heartbeat. But you don't even realize it. No one does, because time has swallowed it whole. What happens to a civilization when even its ruins forget how to speak? What happens when a people invent the written word, only to have their story buried for 4,000 years? And what if in some subtle, haunting way, their forgotten dreams still whisper through us today? This is not just a history of mud bricks and myths. This is the echo of the first time a human asked, "Who am I? Who are the gods? What does it mean to rule, to worship, to die?" Ancient Mesopotamia is where these questions were first carved into clay and baked into eternity. But here's the paradox. They created permanence, only to be erased. They built ziggurats tall enough to kiss the sky, only to be drowned in desert wind. They named stars, mapped the heavens, recorded laws, and then disappeared into a silence so vast we didn't even know they existed until the 19th century. Why did the first civilization, the one that gave us time, writing, law, and kings, vanish into the sand with barely a whisper? How could something so monumental, so groundbreaking, just be forgotten? Could it be that all greatness contains within it the seeds of its own disappearance? Could it be that in our obsession to control the world, we create systems too heavy for their own soul? And here's the real question. Are we living out the same script today, without even knowing it? You see, Mesopotamia wasn't just a place. It was an idea, a living dream born between two rivers, shaped by floods and gods, by kings and slaves, by hunger and vision. And like all dreams, it dissolved. But not without leaving a scar in the human psyche, a blueprint that still haunts how we think, how we work, how we pray. In this story, you will walk through cities older than the pyramids. You will meet gods with wings, kings with divine blood, and scribes who believed every word could trap eternity in a tablet. You will watch the birth of law, the first wars, the earliest science, and the quiet collapse of a people who did everything first, and were rewarded with oblivion. But before we unfold that tale, ask yourself this. What does it mean to build a civilization when time itself is your only enemy? What good is being first if no one remembers? Perhaps, by the end of this journey, as you drift into sleep, you'll realize the story of Mesopotamia is not just about them. It's about us and what we leave behind when we think we're building forever. Let's begin. Beneath the sun-baked plains of southern Iraq, where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates used to sing in rhythm with the wind, lay the bones of a world we barely understand. Not bones of people, but of systems, beliefs, and dreams that once dared to organize the chaos of human existence. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was not born out of abundance. It was carved out of anxiety about the sky, the flood, the famine, and the unknown. You might imagine civilization emerging from comfort. But what if the opposite is true? What if civilization is actually the child of fear? The rivers flooded violently, unpredictably. The soil was rich but fragile, the climate cruel. And so the people of Sumer didn't merely plant crops, they planned the heavens. They didn't simply build homes, they built temples that pierced the clouds. They didn't just speak, they created writing, law, calendars, bureaucracy. Why? To create order, to force meaning, to tame the terror of unpredictability. And here lies the hidden psychological root, the same one that still governs us today. The human mind cannot tolerate chaos. When faced with uncertainty, our ancestors created gods to explain the wind, priests to interpret the gods, kings to command the people, and scribes to record every grain of wheat. And at the heart of it all, the silent terror of not knowing what tomorrow would bring. Carl Jung once wrote that man is not only threatened by the chaos outside him, but by the chaos within. And so ancient Mesopotamia became a mirror not of what they had, but of what they feared. They invented writing cuneiform not for poetry or myth at first, but for accounting, grain, taxes, rations, transactions. The first written symbols were not prayers, but payments, debts, control. Their gods were terrifying, capricious, vindictive, unknowable. The gods of Mesopotamia didn't love humanity, they tolerated it, and only if you served them well. This wasn't a world of forgiveness. It was a world of obedience, hierarchy, and surveillance. The gods watched, the kings enforced, the scribes remembered. Even the afterlife, a gray, dusty, miserable echo, offered no release. Yet this is the same world that created the Code of Ur-Nammu, and later Hammurabi's Code, some of the first known legal systems in human history. They measured justice, divided classes, regulated trade. They were crude, but astonishing. They turned chaos into control. But what is the cost of control? Nietzsche warned us that when we stare too long into the abyss stares back. And perhaps the Mesopotamians learned this in their own way, not through philosophy, but through architecture, theology, and kingship. Their ziggurats reached toward heaven, yet never quite touched it. They dreamed of eternal kingdoms, but they were always rebuilding, always recovering from collapse, always haunted by drought, war, or divine silence. And still, they believed. They recorded. They endured. This is where Aldous Huxley's insight becomes eerily relevant. The more powerful the instruments of control, the more subtly they enslave us. The Mesopotamians created powerful systems to survive a brutal world. But in doing so, they may have locked themselves in. They built cities that depended on irrigation and kings who depended on fear. They created laws that promised justice, but often enforced inequality. Their writing preserved memory, but also preserved trauma. Every transaction, every tax, every punishment, all frozen in clay. And here is the deeper paradox. The very things they built to liberate themselves from nature eventually enslaved them to civilization. The fear of the wild gave birth to the city. But the city became another kind of wilderness, one ruled by gods made in man's own fearful image. Sartre once said, "Man is condemned to be free." But the Mesopotamians seemed to ask, what if freedom itself is the burden? What if we don't want freedom, but order, obedience, protection? The truth is, many of us still live in Mesopotamia, not in geography, but in psyche. We organize our lives with clocks, apps, metrics. We track calories like ancient scribes tracked barley. We worship algorithms like they worshipped omens. We still fear the unknown, and still build towering systems to control it. So here's the question that haunts this section of the story. Did Mesopotamia fall because of weakness, or because their strength became too rigid to adapt? Is there something about the very nature of civilization, of building systems so vast, so complex, that ensures their eventual collapse? This isn't just a story of ancient empires. It's a reflection of ourselves. And perhaps, just perhaps, what we're about to see next will feel a little too familiar. Imagine a city rising in the desert, its bricks carved with cuneiform symbols. The ziggurat looms like a mountain of human will, closer to the gods than any man has stood before. The river bends like a silver ribbon nearby. But this is not peace. This is not paradise. This is Ur, or perhaps Babylon, or Nineveh. It doesn't matter. The names changed. The illusion did not. Because beneath the shimmering architecture, beneath the myth of kings and priests, something else was growing. Something invisible. Something modern. Alienation. We often think of ancient civilizations as primitive or mystical, but Mesopotamia was shockingly modern in one critical way. It was the first place where the individual became invisible inside the machine of the state. You were no longer a person. You were a role, a statistic, a quota, a brick in a wall someone else decided needed to be built. Let's look deeper. The average Sumerian citizen lived in a stratified transactional world. You owed labor to the temple. You owed taxes to the king. You had a social class written in stone. You had duties, not dreams. The temples, once places of worship, became economic engines. The priests were no longer mystics, they were landowners, administrators, hoarders of grain and influence. Even gods had hierarchies like celestial bureaucracies. You didn't pray with devotion, you paid in offerings, in labor, in silence. If something went wrong, it was your fault. A missed ritual, a forgotten oath, a single unknown transgression. The people lived beneath the sky and beneath the law, both equally unpredictable. And this uncertainty gave birth to something we now call cognitive dissonance, a psychological conflict that arises when we hold contradictory beliefs. You were told the gods were just, but your child died in a flood. You were told the king was chosen by heaven, but his soldiers beat you in the streets. You were told obedience brings reward, but all you had was barley, mud, and fear. So what did the Mesopotamians do? They rationalized. They created myths to explain the suffering. They built rituals to delay the judgment. They conformed, because rebellion even thought was dangerous. And that's how systems survive long after their logic breaks down, by turning dissent into heresy and doubt into sin. Jean-Paul Sartre once argued that hell is other people not because of malice, but because of roles. Once we are defined by labels, positions, and expectations, we no longer see each other. We become functions. That's what Mesopotamian civilization did. It scaled. But scaling has consequences. The village becomes a city. The family becomes a class. The dream becomes a debt. And over time, the systems created to protect life begin to replace life. Even their myths tell us this. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero, a king, becomes obsessed with immortality. He has everything: power, wealth, glory, but none of it fills him. None of it stops the decay. His best friend dies. The gods laugh. And in the end, Gilgamesh is left wandering broken, wiser, empty. That story wasn't just about death. It was about a king and a civilization realizing that control is not salvation. This, perhaps, is the most haunting consequence of Mesopotamian genius. They could count the stars, but not the cost of forgetting what it means to be human. The gears turned. The harvests came. The cities grew. But in the shadows the soul whispered, "I was not made to kneel forever." But who would hear that whisper? Not the king, he was too busy appeasing gods made in his own image. Not the scribe, his hands ached from copying laws he did not write. Not the priest, his wealth depended on silence. Only the exiled, the forgotten, the dreamers may have felt it. But by then, the tide of time was already shifting. Empires rose, but the land was drying. Armies marched, but the walls were crumbling. Temples echoed, but the gods had gone quiet. Mesopotamia began to collapse not in one great tragedy, but in layers. Slow erosion, economic overreach, environmental strain, internal rot, and through it all, the people persisted. That's the tragedy and the miracle. Even as systems failed, the idea of civilization remained. Because that's what makes this story so unsettling. We carry the ruins with us, the need to measure, to track, to assign value, to fear gods we do not see and obey systems we do not question. Mesopotamia did not vanish. It transformed into us. We still write, still count, still organize. But have we asked why? Have we considered that beneath all our control, there may still be an ancient fear, a hunger for meaning, a silence we dare not name? The unseen consequence of Mesopotamia is not its collapse. It's how deeply it still lives within us. And unless we face that, we may build even higher towers, only to forget again why we started climbing. A scribe, weary from years of copying the king's decrees, steps outside the temple for the last time. The ink has dried, but the questions still burn. He walks through the crumbling alleyways of a once mighty city, past clay tablets, past broken statues, past the gods. And he wonders, what if none of this was sacred? What if the gods were echoes of human fear, not divine will? This wasn't just fiction. Even in ancient Mesopotamia, the epicenter of order and hierarchy, there were moments of rebellion. Silent ones, private ones, philosophical ones. Buried in the ruins of Nineveh, archaeologists found tablets not of worship, but of doubt. One tablet, known as the Dialogue of Pessimism, records a servant and master debating every choice in life. Should we marry? Should we rebel? Should we love? Each time they reach a conclusion and then immediately destroy it. It ends with the master saying, "Kill me then." To which the servant replies, "I prefer not to." That's not obedience. That's existential exhaustion, a whisper of rebellion in the language of despair. So how do we centuries later break free from the systems we inherited? We start where Mesopotamia ended, in silence, in ruins, in questions. Step 1. Dismantle the inner ziggurat. The ziggurat, that grand tiered temple, wasn't just a building. It was a symbol, a spiritual hierarchy, a pyramid of worth, gods on top, slaves at the bottom. But what if you've built one inside your own mind? What if your thoughts are ranked good versus bad, worthy versus shameful, sacred versus useless? This is what Carl Jung called the shadow, the parts of yourself society told you to suppress. Your wildness, your doubt, your hunger, your fear. Mesopotamian society punished chaos, but creativity is born from chaos. To rebel is to let your mind become untidy again. To stop thinking in columns, to stop labeling your soul like a grain ledger. Ask yourself, who decided what parts of me are acceptable? You didn't. The rebellion begins when you start reclaiming what you were taught to abandon. Step 2. Rediscover inner myth. The ancients lived in myth, not as fantasy, but as inner architecture. Gilgamesh's journey wasn't about slaying beasts. It was about confronting mortality, loneliness, grief, ego. We've replaced myth with data. But data does not comfort. Spreadsheets do not speak to the soul. To break free is to reawaken symbolic thinking. Joseph Campbell once said, "Myth is the secret opening through which the inexhaustible energies of the cosmos pour into human cultural manifestation." In other words, you need a story to make sense of your suffering, not a law, not a spreadsheet, a story. When you dream, when you imagine, when you listen to the ancient voices, you're not escaping, you're returning. Step 3. Resist the sacred lie. The lie is this. This is the way it has always been. Mesopotamian rulers inscribed this lie in stone, but even stone erodes. The priest king said the gods demanded war. The gods were silent. It was man who chose violence. The rebellion is not in fire or blood, but in noticing. Noticing when your fear is being manipulated. Noticing when your worth is being measured in coins or compliance. Noticing when your awe is being sold back to you as product, doctrine, algorithm. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. You are not a grain of barley. You are not a footnote on a tax ledger. You are a universe, waking slowly in human form. To break free is to stop asking for permission to be whole." Step 4. Create your own temple. What was the temple really? A place to remember. But over time, remembering became repetition. And repetition became control. So you must build a new temple not of bricks, but of rituals that return you to yourself. Maybe it's walking at dawn. Maybe it's journaling your dreams. Maybe it's saying no to what feels false. Rebellion doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sleeps deeply, feels honestly, loves slowly. That, too, is sacred. Because here's the truth. You don't need to overthrow an empire. You just need to stop feeding it with your silence. And perhaps the most radical act? Forgiveness. Not the passive kind. The kind that says, yes, they lied to me. Yes, they used me. But I will not become them. Because bitterness is just another form of slavery. And your freedom must be quiet enough to outlast vengeance. Now you're standing on the same soil where Sumerians once wept beneath the stars. But unlike them, you know the empire was not eternal. You know the gods were not always right. You know that civilization, for all its brilliance, was also a prison. And you are waking up. We were told that civilization was progress, that temples and taxes, calendars and conquest would bring us meaning. But what if meaning doesn't live in monuments? What if it lives in moments? A child watching the stars from a mud brick rooftop. A poet whispering verses beside the Euphrates. A nameless woman burying her lost child, whispering prayers to gods who never answered. Meaning was never in the system. It was always in the spaces between the systems. And that's where you are now. You were taught to chase achievement, to measure your life in metrics and milestones. But the Sumerians, for all their brilliance, are gone. Their empires collapsed, their kings forgotten. Even their gods are nameless dust. But the questions they asked, those still echo. Why are we here? What makes a life sacred? How do we face the fact that we must die? These are the immortal truths, not the answers. The questions. You are the myth they couldn't write. They wrote epics about kings and gods, but they never imagined you. A soul standing on the edge of digital time, haunted by both memory and possibility. A creature of clay and electricity, floating in a world they couldn't conceive. And yet, you are exactly what they were reaching for. Because in every temple they built, every tablet they etched, every ziggurat they raised toward the stars, they were trying to leave behind a whisper. We were here. We felt things. We wondered why. That's all you need to be. You don't need to conquer. You don't need to prove. You don't need to obey the voices of dead kings whispering rules from broken stones. You just need to be human, awake, and willing to feel everything. The dream was the point. We often think of ancient civilizations as real and myths as illusion. But what if it's the opposite? What if the empire was the dream and the myth was the truth? Because myths speak in a language logic cannot. They tell us that you are not your job, or your role, or your productivity. You are Gilgamesh mourning Enkidu. You are Ishtar raging and weeping. You are a cosmic being in temporary form, asking old questions under a new sky. And the myth is not a story from the past, it's your own inner landscape, waiting to be remembered. Death is the teacher, not the enemy. This was the final truth Gilgamesh could not escape. He sought immortality. He climbed mountains, dove into oceans, faced beasts and gods. And still, death waited. But not as punishment, as teacher. Because only when he faced death did he finally see life not as conquest, but as gift. This is your final rebellion against Mesopotamian order, not to avoid death, not to worship it, but to walk beside it, to let it whisper, not scream. This moment matters. This breath is sacred. This night is enough. The quiet conquest. You were promised power. The ancients built empires in search of permanence. But permanence was a lie. Only presence endures. So you begin your own conquest. Now. A quiet one. Not of land. Not of people. But of your awareness. Every time you choose silence over noise, stillness over fear, depth over distraction, You are undoing the empire, and something beautiful takes its place. A temple made of breath, a ritual made of rest, a civilization inside your soul untouched by time. The tigress will one day rise again, the clay will soften, new civilizations will bloom and crumble. But your inner river, it flows quietly tonight. And maybe, just maybe that's enough. Sleep now. You are no longer a citizen of fear. You are a child of time, and the story never ends.